Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Sorry that it's a bit warm, but I'm Canadian, so that's a rare and pleasant experience for me. We are talking on this panel about a really important issue, and one which I think is not only the responsibility of governments, of journalists, of NGOs, it's really a responsibility of our societies. And that is, how do we operate in this pretty new world of disinformation? And I would even say, I think disinformation is sort of too weak a term. I would say in a world where we know that there are malign influences seeking to disrupt our democracies. And my own view, and I'm going to just share this with the panel, you guys can agree or disagree. I think that the biggest threat is not so much malign influences seeking to achieve any one result. I really think the biggest threat is malign forces, countries, movements that are openly and explicitly opposed to democracy, opposed to the liberal idea, seeking to undermine the whole notion that liberal democracy can exist, the whole notion that actual facts, verifiable, falsifiable facts and truth exists. You know, I think the real threat is this kind of muddying of the waters that seeks to make all citizens kind of say, you know, throw our hands up and say, a pox on all their houses, they're all wretched, and what's the point of trying, of doing the hard daily work of being a liberal democracy? So that to me is the danger. Our panelists know a lot about it and are going to share with us both what the threat is, but I also hope, very crucially, what some of the answers are. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel, then I'm going to start asking them questions. So right beside me is my good friend, Edgars Rinkēvičs. We have now met how many weeks in a row? We go to a lot of different meetings together because Canada and Latvia are very good friends and very like-minded on a number of issues, not the least of which is Canada is very delighted to be the leader of the NATO battalion, which is stationed in Latvia, and we're very glad to be there, Edgars. Beside Edgars is Courtney Rush. She is advocacy director of a hugely important organization that has figured prominently in both the organization and the actual implementation of this conference, the Committee to Protect Journalists. Beside her is Beata Balogova, who is the editor-in-chief of SME in Slovakia, and the vice chair of the International Press Institute. Very nice to see you, Beata. Beside Beata is Edison Lanza. He's the special rapporteur for freedom of expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And then finally, beside Edison is Emine Japarova. And Emine is the first deputy minister of the Ministry of Information Policy of Ukraine. She is a Crimean Tatar, and I hope we'll have a chance to speak about the very extreme and specific repression that the Crimean Tatars are suffering in Russian-occupied Crimea. So I'm delighted everybody is here. I'm going to start with Edgars, because one of the things that Canada has discovered from leading the NATO mission in Latvia is we are learning as much from our Latvian allies as we are helping them. And one of the things that I think Latvia is very good at, because circumstance has forced you to be, is dealing with disinformation. So I'd like to hear from you, Edgars. What do you face? What do we all face? And what's the best way of responding?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this very kind introduction, Chrystia, and nice to see you now in London, because we had last week very good Ukraine Reform Conference in Toronto that was hosted by the government of Canada, where we were also discussing some of those issues that we are going to tackle today. But then we had also some kind of geographical focus. Let me just share a couple of points. First of all, one thing that we all should understand, that disinformation or propaganda is nothing new. It's not a new concept. If you look back at, let's say, all those Cold War years or even before, a lot of propaganda efforts were made by governments. There have been fake news over time. But what is unique today is how those news, how propaganda, how disinformation is spread. With internet, with social media, it is very easy that each and every of us, if we get followers, 15,000, 30,000, 100,000, become more influential than any of printed media, at least in Latvia, definitely. So this is one thing that we all should understand, that there is a new dynamics, but some of the tricks are still old. And the first thing that my country has now advocated for a couple of years within the European Union, but also more globally, is we need to have the same kind of regulation on social media that is governing also the so-called classical or regular media. Because if we don't address some of issues of accountability, responsibility, then we are going to see a lot of trouble. Second, indeed, if I look back at history, back in 2014, when there was illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia, when events in eastern part of Ukraine started, Latvia, along with some of our friends, the Baltic states, Poland, Sweden, were begging the Council of Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union to address resilience issue of the whole Union. Because we saw that those events in Ukraine were very much followed by very strong information warfare. And then people were saying, no, this is about free speech. We shouldn't do anything. We should let government-sponsored propaganda instruments like Russia Today or Sputnik or anything else everywhere in. And we are just very democratic and very open-minded. A couple of years later, we discovered meddling in elections. We have just seen that actually the mood has changed enormously. And now we are debating all those measures. We just had elections last year, but we have discovered at least two things that helped us to survive those elections without any significant interference. One, very good cooperation and coordination between government agencies, but also very good cooperation with some social media platforms. The third and the most important thing is about media and journalists. I think that it is very important to keep in mind that the only fact-checkers who have time to dig in are journalists. But the trouble with journalists are, the first, they are not very well paid. The classic media is kind of disappearing because of social media, or at least transforming. And also the fact is that they need to learn the new tricks all the time, the new kind of experience sharing. And here in Latvia we have the Center of Excellence of the Baltic Center of Excellence on Media, where actually journalists are sharing their best experiences themselves. So raising the journalistic awareness, quality of media is very important. But then again, this is very also tricky. Now back home in my country, we are having a huge debate about public media, about the way how we can finance it, how we can strengthen it, what we can do about all those traditional media. The problem is that the governments cannot finance journalism, because then we actually get into the trap. So the way how we can actually address also more independent crowdsourcing, financing is very important also to strengthen media. I stop here because there are many people on the panel and they have many thoughts about those issues.
Okay, well, no, thank you very much, Edgars. And you know, I just do want to echo, I think that it is so important for all of us from places like Toronto or London to listen to people in countries that really, even more than we are on the front lines of this experience. And I'm really glad you're here to share that with us, Edgars. Okay, Courtney. This is your job. You think about this all the time. How do you identify the problem today, and what should we be doing about it?
Well, just an easy question to answer. So first off, I think it's absolutely true that propaganda, what we're calling disinformation today, is not a new issue, and good journalism is a great antidote. But it's a complex social, political, technological, economic trust problem, and so we need to look at solutions across all of those domains. And just to maybe encapsulate one specific way that we're really seeing the impact of, disinformation and its flip side, which is the fight to combat disinformation, is in the types of laws and regulations that are being passed around the world that are trying to combat disinformation. The Poynter Center has identified at least 48 countries that are having some sort of initiatives that are aimed at combating misinformation or somehow addressing it. And at least 28 countries, according to the Computational Propaganda Initiative, have weaponized disinformation systems. So in this context, we're also seeing that countries are adopting legislation to try to fight back. So we've seen a rash of essentially fake news, disinformation laws passed ostensibly to restrict the circulation of disinformation, but in many cases it's being used to imprison journalists. So we have been keeping records of journalists who are imprisoned for their work since the early 1990s, and we've always had false news as a category. I'm trying to figure out, exactly why, but we know that so it's not something new, but only a couple to a handful of journalists were imprisoned on false news charges until 2016, when we saw that number rise to 9. Now, that's the same year that President Donald Trump took office. In 2017 and 2018, that number rose astronomically. So in our last prison census, we had 3 times as many journalists in jail on false news charges. So we're seeing that this is exactly the wrong antidote, exactly the wrong solution to imprison journalists. And I used to work as a journalist, and I did my doctoral research in Egypt. Egypt has a law that makes it a crime to report statistics on terrorism that don't reflect what the official ministry's position is. When I worked as a journalist in Dubai, before I got kicked out for an article I wrote, they were trying to pass legislation that would criminalize the publication of news that negatively impacted the economy. And this was in 2009, when there literally was no other story than the implosion of the economy. And so it was almost like they were trying to legislate us into writing false news. But it's not just about the legislative frameworks and what the governments are doing in terms of the disinformation space. There is, of course, the technological issue. The platforms and the media ecosystem are built on a logic that favors extremism, that favors engagement, and that favors a cohesion around a certain few numbers of platforms, because that's where all the eyeballs are. And so, then the extremism, the disinformation is favored because it's very hard if you're just reporting a factual, straightforward story where maybe a lot of people won't even go beyond the headline. If the headline says, war in Syria leaves X number of people dead, maybe people aren't going to read that. It's still an important headline, but it's not going to get the clicks, right? So the algorithmic logic of our media ecosystem disincentivizes straightforward and kind of non-engaging news. And don't even talk about local news trying to, compete in this environment, and local news being a great antidote to disinformation and misinformation. Because if you think about it, I agree with you that it is partly about the warfare aspect at the nation state level, but it's also about the, anti-vaccine issues, the, ability to know what's happening to your water system, like in Flint, Michigan. And we depend on journalists to bring out that information. But there's also a very important role for politicians. Politicians are increasingly recognizing that they are living and speaking in this type of media ecosystem. And so we hear lots of misstatements, falsehoods, lies from politicians. It's very hard for journalists to figure out how to report that. The Washington Post started an initiative to track how many misstatements or falsehoods President Trump says. How can you not report what a politician says? It is inherently newsworthy. So when you have politicians are actually being responsible for false news. And so I think we need to have a commitment, and I would love to see this come out of this conference, for politicians to not essentially broadcast fake news through their statements, because that is then picked up and amplified through the media. Similarly, there's a real, mixed record on fact-checking initiatives, because a lot of things that, they're looking at it's not factual or not, it's about opinion. And even when we send signals, for example, YouTube launched a project to try to label some outlets on YouTube as state-owned or as publicly owned. And so I did an analysis, and it's just very unclear how to determine media ownership. So, if we're looking for a solution, let's be more transparent about media ownership so that we can send that signal instead of relying on a private platform trying to figure out that research that even media researchers have a hard time with. And as we're talking about solutions, how about improving access to information and being more forthcoming with information? Again, what can governments do? We're here at a government-sponsored conference. They can provide more information so that we don't have to try to, dig or figure out what's what, because, we can't get access. And we've seen we've seen the proliferation of freedom of information laws, but not necessarily their implementation. And so if we want to fight back disinformation and misinformation, I think we have to look at what governments can do, both proactively and not just reactively.
Okay, well, so many different comments and thoughts. I'm especially glad that you spoke about ownership. And, Edgars also spoke about the financial side of journalism. I think often at events like this, at meetings like this, we don't talk about that side of things, but it's such an important driver. And also the impact of new technologies and how they have transformed, how we receive news, but also how news is created. So I hope we will continue to explore that. Beata, please.
I will, since I'm a journalist, I will start where Courtney actually almost finished, and it's the responsibility of local politicians in the Visegrad region for legitimizing fake news sites. We are talking about Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Poland. Since they want to weaken the effect of critical news reporting, they more often turn to fake news sites, because these sites, without questioning their messages, just transmit them. It happened several times that a leading politician gave an exclusive interview to a site which is clearly dubiously financed, we assume, from Russia. And by doing so, they short-sightedly, just for a couple more votes, they help undermining democratic institutions. It is even worse in Hungary, because Viktor Orbán elevated fake news to a state doctrine. So he created this massive propaganda machine by suffocating free media. And he's spreading messages which in any normal democracy would be classified as anti-Semitic fake news. By doing the Soros discourse, blaming for any weakness of the country, George Soros, the financier, he actually killed public discourse as such. And I will just say one example. When Freedom House, the organization, downgraded Hungary's democracy rating, and he was asked about it, he gave just the short sentence: this organization is financed by George Soros. And here, I would actually stress the responsibility of the international community to be firm enough to draw red lines, because by not confronting enough these local autocrats with the way they treat free press, they legitimize that. And if Viktor Orbán can get away with it, he is inspiring other politicians with autocratic tendencies in the region, and they will feel we can get away with it as well. And we can see it, how the Soros type of discourse, that protests against corruption are organized by George Soros. And more politicians are using it. And we can see that the whole fake news scene has been growing in Slovakia, also in Hungary. It is because the public is confused. Very similar messages are spread by these fake news sites and the politicians. And so for us, as critical media, what we can do, we explain how we do news reporting, we explain difference between opinion and facts, but without a more active approach of those politicians who care for democracy, it's very hard to do. One more point, in these countries, especially Hungary and Slovakia, the public service television is more or less under state control. So private media have to substitute the role of public service media. Again, just the very sad example, in Slovakia, the public service television is directed by a guy who concluded a contract with Sputnik News when he was running the state news wire. And if the media wouldn't be really shouting that it is a scandal, they would have not killed the contract. And it really shows that without a massive international response to, or maybe definition that what constitutes to dismantling democratic institutions, it will be very hard for local journalists in these countries, which actually 30 years ago, like I was on the streets, I was one of the students of the Velvet Revolution. And you know, 30 years after, I see the same communist methods coming back, combined with technology, and it makes me worry. And I see that after 30 years, we are again like somehow murking those lines, and we hope that the public will somehow, by self-learning, understand what constitutes for, you know, harming democracy and what's not. And maybe that's one of the points. Just quickly, in Slovakia, most critical media are doing like busting fake news and doing these initiatives. There is also an initiative where we created a list of fake news sites, and we appealed to advertisers, like responsible advertisers, not to advertise with these news sites. And so these little things work, but I really think that without international pressure, we will be just helpless towards the growth of these, the new fake news empire, because Hungary and Slovakia is a huge target of Russian hybrid war.
Well, I was going to say thank you for that bleak diagnosis, but I can't say thank you for the bleakness. But thank you also for the work that you are doing every day to counter that, and also, you know, for some of the specific initiatives that you've described. And when we come back, I want to hear how you feel the younger generation, you know, those kids who you were during the Velvet Revolution, how they are feeling about all this. Edison, moving perhaps to a different part of the world, I'd like to hear your perspective from our hemisphere, and how are things going in our hemisphere?
Yeah.
We had some very inspiring, but also rather dark descriptions we heard yesterday from Luz about what it's like being a journalist in Venezuela today, for example.
Yeah. Well, indeed, we have a menu in similar way that the previous panelists. I think that the first time that we in the hemisphere heard about fake news and misinformation is in the election 2016 in US, and more linked with the foreign intrusion and malicious information, inject malicious information through the social media. No? But also the phenomena, have another, areas in the different countries. For example, in the last election in Brazil, is more linked with use for the politician and the parties, the parties in Brazil to spread misinformation, to the other side of the campaign. No? In the case of the referendum in Colombia for the peace, it's more similar to here in the Brexit case in Britain, being related with some chaos around the process and around the consequence of the eventual consequence of the peace process. And also we have authoritarian, governments or regimes like Venezuela or Nicaragua and another presidents around the hemisphere that use this kind of narrative, to distract the role of the press, to discredit the press, and use fake news like an insult against the true media or the traditional media. No? And in the other hand, we need to be so rigorous and precise with the definition. And now, thanks for Canada and other countries to address this issue in the Organization for American States, that give the mandate of our office to do a guidelines for the state to address this phenomena in the different ways. The first point is to define misinformation, because in democracy it's normal that the society lead with the lies and the falsificates news, and the debate is to want to resolve this discussion. But this kind of disinformation, it's like a deliberate injection of misinformation to deceive the public and to impact in the electoral process, for example. It's not the similar misinformation that we traditionally lead in the media or in the field of the society. The second point is the response of the states, because in some cases we look, for example, in Honduras and in other countries, that the policymakers try to pass law to restrict freedom of expression, not to attack the phenomena, even rather to attack the media, the traditional media, and the press, using like ambiguous penal or criminal figure to respond. Finally, I think agree with the idea that we need a multi-stakeholder approach for this phenomena. I think that is one point is the response of the states. The second is the duty of the public official to use with rigorous and with responsibility their freedom of expression. Third, the responsibility of the platform and the intermediaries, because we try to protect with a legal framework, the use of the flow of information through the platform and the no liability at the platform. But on the other hand, they are a big player today in the public debate, and we need to reinforce the responsibility of the platform to attack this phenomenon, because the polarization or the use of the platform to polarize the society, it's a reality, it's a fact. The lack of transparency in the management of the content by the platforms that have a consequence in the shutdowns and freedom of speech and speech that will be protected by the freedom by the international law. And also, the management of the advertisings, or the business model that do not favorize the traditional media. On the other hand, we don't know who contract, for example, advertising to also spread misinformation through this kind of, deal with the platform. And finally, the role of the traditional media to encourage, the quality of the journalists and the paper of the play of the other civil society actors like the check-fackers and so on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think it's important, you know, both you and Courtney have reminded us of the double-edged sword of legislation against this, and that it can, whether inadvertently or sometimes quite intentionally, you know, under the guise of fighting disinformation, you can actually be fighting information. And I do think that's something that you're both right to point to that we need to be mindful of. Amin, we heard Edgars right at the very beginning talk about 2014 and the invasion and annexation of Crimea being a real turning point for the world and something that Latvia understood immediately. Maybe it took other countries a little longer to figure out how critical that was. I would love to hear from you, maybe first of all, a little bit about what has happened to the people in particular, but not only media in occupied Crimea. I know there are some brave people like Oleg Sentsov who are in jail.
Thank you, Chrystia. Дякую. Dear ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, distinguished guests, Selam aleikum, вітаю вас. I addressed you both in Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian languages for one reason, because I'm a Crimean Tatar indigenous Muslim entity that lives in Crimea, and Ukrainian because I'm a citizen of Ukraine and fighting for my country, for its territorial integrity, because it's still under the war, it's still under the occupation. The results are really dreadful because we have 7% of our territory under the occupation, 13,000 people dead in the war, 25,000 wounded, and it's still an ongoing process where Russia even denies the very presence of its regular army in Donbas, on the eastern part of my country, same as he did in Crimea when we had this first green men without identification. Russian soldiers invade Crimea. Mr. Putin at the press conference, he said, oh, you can buy the military uniform in every single shop. This is not the Russian army. But then he recognized the very presence of Russian army. And of course, the result is really dreadful, not only for the freedom of speech, but also for the population. So today, Crimea is a military base. Right at this very moment, 60 Crimean Tatar activists were arrested in Moscow because they had a rally to support those 4 Crimean Tatars who were convicted for 11 years in prison just for being Muslims, because Russia claims that they are the extremists and those who belong to the so-called Hizb ut-Tahrir religious organization, which was not prohibited in Ukraine, but is prohibited and declared to be an extremist in Russia. And we believe that these politically motivated judgments, sentences, convictions, detains, kidnappings of people, we still have over 30 citizens of Ukraine kidnapped and no one knows where we have 150 political prisoners, those who may only put a Facebook post that Crimea is Ukraine, because the criminal code of Russian Federation may sentence you for the 5 years in jail just for one reason, if you claim that Crimea is Ukraine. And the whole civilized world today knows that Crimea is Ukraine. It was reaffirmed many times in different United Nations resolutions, and no one doubts that this is Ukraine. So I also want to share my personal story. I remember, because I am a former journalist. I used to live in Crimea when the occupation happened. I witnessed all of this curtailment of freedom of media and how they tried to show that we had the referendum, which was not true, because only 1/3 of population really voted. They were forced to vote. And today they claim that they had the true vote of the citizens of Crimea or the Crimeans, and who they wanted to be with Russia. But this is, again, the fake that unfortunately has been spreaded by many, including international media. I remember that in March 2014, the signal of Ukrainian media was shut down. So not a single Ukrainian radio or TV station is in Crimea anymore, or in Donbas anymore. Just one number, 500 frequencies today illegally used by Russian media in Crimea only, because they mopped out the Ukrainian media, they brought Russian local national media, and they spread propaganda using the Ukrainian frequencies. And I remember when the Ukrainian signal was shut down, me and my colleague Osman Pashayev, also a Crimean Tatar journalist, we went to make a piece of news for the former state-funded TV channel, because the TV tower that spread the broadcasting was there. And we were not allowed to enter the premises, even though we had the permission. And we had the group of self-defense guys, but actually the FSB, who were saying that they are the tourists from Moscow, just attending Crimea. They were not wearing military uniform. And then in a couple of hours after, the already controlled state TV channel came up with the pieces of news that the terrorists, Osman Pashayev and Emine Japar, was trying to attack. Yeah. So they called us terrorists, and at that very moment we realized that we started to live in this distorted mirrors, when normal people and average people are called extremists, terrorists, when Ukrainians are called fascists and Nazis, radicals and banderas, you know, those who, and they're trying to this kind of come up with this narrative, misusing different platforms and not only classic media like Russia Today or Sputnik, but also social media, Facebook, YouTube. I will go to very concrete and practical examples that I'm dealing with professionally. So unfortunately today what we see is that the Western world really underestimates the cognitive influence. So whenever it's about Western perception of information security, it mostly focuses on cybersecurity. But the cognitive influence, something that we hear, we listen, we watch, really is like a radiation. We can't see it, but it really influences our minds. So we believe that the information space in Russia, it's really intoxicated. 1/3 of news is actually about Ukraine. Sometimes we have a feeling that the citizens of Russian Federation knows much more than we do know about ourselves. And there is just one episode. Very soon we're gonna commemorate the death of almost 300 Dutch citizens who were down at the Malaysian plane MH17. And this story on how Russia Today and many other Russian media covered this story is a very illustrative in terms of disinformation and navigating disinformation. There was a Twitter blog of the so-called aircraft operator in the airport in Kiev, Borispol. His name was Carlos. They created this Twitter account many days before the accident happened. And then this Twitter account came up with many disinformation that the plane was down by the Ukrainian soldiers and many more. And only in March 2018, we found out that this Carlos was a fake account, and the man who was operating this account was the one who was convicted in Romania for felony and also arrested in some other countries. And then he, in his interview for Radio Liberty, he acknowledged that he received almost $50,000 as a payment from Russia Today to come up with these lies. And this is, of course, not the only example on how distortive and how manipulative can Russian media be. So the military doctrine of Russian Federation in 2015 directly said that the cognitive instruments have been reinforced, and you have to imagine and clearly know that for them it's not about freedom of media at all. It's about systematic, operated and planned work when they involve media, when they involve so-called experts, we call them silly idiots, who attend different international
I think
platforms.
Lenin had a term coming.
Yeah, yeah. And they attend different forums, delivering their truth. And there is also my personal example to you. There is this human dimension implementation forum in Warsaw, when the OSCE member states and civil society come together in Warsaw and discuss different issues. The second day traditionally is about freedom of media. And I've been representing Ukraine for 3 years, and this year Russia was very active. They brought approximately 13 NGOs with different names like Institution of Freedom of Speech, Institution of Consciousness, of History, and many more. And the only task of these NGOs was to speak about the absence of freedom of Ukraine. And when we recalled to them and asked what is going on in Russia with freedom of media, they could not respond. So unfortunately, we see how these so-called experts have been used and misused on different levels. So we believe that the Western world have to understand that for Russia to go not only in Ukraine and thwart it from within, but also Western values and democracy, when hybrid warfare is about using democratic tools to thwart the very democracy is the main matter. And Edgars and Courtney said that, of course, it's not something new that we have, propaganda. But classic propaganda was supposed to convince you that this is not the water, that this is the wine. Today's propaganda is about making you lose your trust that this is the water. It's making you doubt that this is the water. It's about manipulating with your consciousness when you don't have any trust to anyone. And I think we all witnessed that. And also to finalize my speech, again, another recent case from the field on how Russia has been misusing Facebook and YouTube. Just a couple of weeks ago, one of the media, Crimean media that had to leave Crimea in 2014 because they mopped out all independent journalism. They received a letter from the legal department of YouTube who claimed upon the letter from Roskomnadzor, and this is the entity that regulates the information space in Russia, that they had to delete one of the pieces of news about Emir Hüseyin Kuku. He's a Crimean terror activist. It's a very live piece of news. It's nothing about extremism or terrorism. It's about the human being and his story and why he's convicted in Russia, actually. And they claimed that they had to delete these pieces of news because Roskomnadzor claims that it violates these anti-terrorist laws that they adopted in 2014, 15, and other years. And unfortunately, when we address, as a Ukrainian government, YouTube or Facebook showing how manipulative can this be, they do not react. So, of course, I think that we have to also think of the instrument, because Ukraine has been the target number one every day on how to achieve its goals. Just recently, we also had the article in Los Angeles Times from the author who traveled to Crimea and came up with this beautiful rosy article saying that this is a very authentic place, that it's sacred to Russia, that it used to belong to Russia for many hundreds of years. It says nothing about the history of indigenous people who were oppressed actually by Catherine II and then the deportation of Stalin when they cleansed Crimea from its indigenous people. It doesn't say anything that if you travel to Crimea directly from Moscow or any other part of Russian city, that you violate the Ukrainian laws. And when we also addressed the Los Angeles Times saying that you have to at least balance or speak about another side of the truth, which is about political persecution, they did not respond. So to cut the long story short, of course, even if some of you would want to travel to Crimea, you would notice how they actively build up infrastructure, because they want to make the Crimea as a showcase, saying that this is the beautiful Russian part. My brother, he is 12 years old. He lives in Kerch, still in Crimea. And the teacher of Russian language and literature, who was brought from the Russian mainland every day, before the Russian literature or language subject starts, 5-10 minutes she devotes to the propaganda, saying how bad it used to be with Ukraine and now how beautiful it is with Russia, and the whole system of education, starting from the kindergarten, ending up with the universities, is very intoxicated. So if you go to Crimea, of course, you will see how they build up prisons, hospitals, roads, for the military purpose actually, but you will never have a chance to feel another side of the coin, which is about persecutions, deteriorations, tortures, and many more. And I think that we really have to seek the ways how to not slip down this issue. And I call upon you and your attention, and I thank you for your time and attention and my chance to share my story. Zahvalnost.
Well, I will say, Wahyu, Amina, thank you very much for sharing that and for the very vivid personal examples. Now, you guys have succeeded in completely depressing me. I don't think that was your objective. It is important to live in the truth and to be clear-eyed about the threat that I think really we are all facing. But I don't want us to leave here, feeling that all is lost. I think I want us to leave here being realistic about the threat, but also being energized about the fact that we are going to act together to do something about it. So we only have 20 minutes left, but I'd like to ask everyone just to speak for a few minutes and talk to us about a few of the things that you have found actually work in your own countries or around the world to actually fight back, to actually navigate this disinformation. And Edgars, not coincidentally, I want to start with you, because look, the reality is, I think Emine was quite right that Ukraine is a huge target. Latvia is a pretty big target also for disinformation, and you guys are still standing. So how do you do it? What are the effective techniques?
Well, you see, this is the good news, that despite many years of being, as some call us, frontline state, we are standing. I think that there are a couple of actually examples or points or things I just want to mention. First, and I don't remember who already mentioned that in the panel, but it is important that we somehow support those efforts that are called fact-checking. Well, I think that when you get journalists digging in and saying that the news you've just read on Facebook, anywhere else, are fake or are not true, this helps enormously. It takes time for general public to understand that not everything that is on internet or on Facebook or on Twitter is the actual factual news, but I think it pays off. The second thing, I do believe also that when you understand a little bit of history, when you are speaking and trying to explain the context to the public, then it also works. My final point that I want to make is that actually I think what is very important, and I know this is very difficult for journalists, because anywhere when we are kind of trying to pass the legislation or actually to close, as we have done, some of, or at least to suspend some of propaganda outlets, people are getting very worried that this is actually an attack on freedom of press. But if you don't do this, if you see that there is an actual breach of the legislation, hate speech has been promoted, then you are also losing, because then those guys think that they can do anything they like. So it is very important to distinguish what is the free media and where the propaganda comes. And here the most important thing is what your courts are doing, because all those things can be challenged in courts. Sometimes the government wins, sometimes it loses, that's fair enough. But if you don't send a clear message that you are not going also to tolerate information war, then you are going to lose it. So it's not only about nice things, about awareness, about education. Sometimes it's also about very strong counteraction.
Okay, Courtney needs to jump in. I think she may disagree, but let's hear what she has to say.
Yeah, I would say there's actually a pretty mixed record on fact-checking initiatives. So we saw, Facebook rolled out this effort to identify stories that were distrusted or may not be false news. And it actually sent a signal to people where they shared it more. And so I don't think that the root of the disinformation problem, as has been alluded to by multiple people, is necessarily that, whether it's fact or fiction, but it's trying to muddy the very idea of truth, and it's just also playing to the political partisanship and the very polarized world that so many of our countries are in. So I think we need to realize the context that we're in, and instead of funding like standalone fact-checking initiatives for Facebook, which also further entrenches Facebook as the dominant platform for news dissemination, let's remember there are many other platforms. So you have, for example, Medium, which has decided to have a particular terms of service and approach that, ideally is encouraging, quality journalism and thoughtful analysis. It's still, some type of social network, or Wikipedia. I think when we're talking about these solutions, we need to talk about, we do need to figure out technological solutions, and I don't think those have been really identified or addressed anywhere because they're complex and they have to do with the economic model of these dominant platforms. But we saw in France around the elections that the news media, the mainstream news media, did get together and discuss how they could work together to fight back against fake news and against disinformation campaigns that they anticipated there. And so they had a working group among the editorial staff, and that was actually pretty successful in that context. First, because academics had mapped out how information flows in the French system, realizing that even though we are a global interconnected system, you still have these kind of national media ecosystems. They're porous, but you can see how information flows. And that worked really well. But what became very hard was when politicians would end up referring to a piece of disinformation in an official speech. And then that would, have to get picked up and quoted by the mainstream media. In the US, we see that fact-checking is integrated into the journalistic endeavor. And I think that, we should also, you talked about we need to fight back. And in the United States, we have the Global Engagement Center. The UK has its own, what it would call, I think, public diplomacy arm, but may or may not be just propaganda. But this basic idea, the Global Engagement Center started to combat ISIS propaganda, and now it's trying to combat Russian disinformation. But the problem is it just muddies the water. I really do think that support for true journalism is the solution. But the problem is we have the decimation of journalism. So to take my country as an example, we have 1,300 news deserts where there are no local news outlets. And so I don't think that it's actually a big challenge about how to fight back against propaganda and disinformation, because as I think everyone agrees, it's not a new issue. What's new is kind of this amplification and the rapidity with which it spreads. But if you can inoculate the public against that by giving them good quality local news, understand how they can tell truth from fiction, that there is such a thing as a glass of water, then when they are manipulated by these, massive, often disinformation campaigns are targeted around elections, when it's already very polarized and you're going to tend to go to the information you believe or want to believe, then I think that holds more promise than a million new initiatives to check facts on Facebook or, fight back against the modern era.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Courtney, and I'm very glad that you mentioned, we want to clap for her. I'm very glad you mentioned the French example. I think that, France learned from the US experience, and it was very impressive the way French civil society and French media actually took some responsibility. We certainly in Canada actually invited some of our friends from France to come and, explain to us a little bit how they had done it. I think it's worth looking at. Beata, I loved so much of what you said, and I was very impressed in particular by the outreach that you and colleagues from the independent media did to advertisers, saying you guys have a responsibility too. I'd like to hear how effective that's been and any other good ideas that you've put in practice, because you told us how rough it is in the Visegrad region, but I think we're also seeing some forces, including you, actually standing up and saying we had the Velvet Revolution for a reason and we're not going to give up.
Yeah. And the initiative for advertisers is still quite effective, to the point that some of the fake news sites are now challenging it with the courts because they say that it's an effort to limit free competition. So I think that it will be also a good reason for the lawyers to look into it as a legal issue. And back to and I was really thinking hard to come up with an optimistic message so I don't disappoint you, but I think that from the point of a journalist, the most important thing is not to lose journalistic standards. Because when we are stressed out, we say, shouldn't we adjust to their language? Shouldn't we simplify our language? shouldn't we start slogan journalism? Because now, like, it's really a communication by slogans, by PR. And when I talk to my colleagues, I always say no. We cannot go down to that level. Like, we cannot simplify language because we kill investigative journalism. You cannot explain, you know, like white horses and fake firms and carousel type of frauds in a simple language, simplified language. And also, I still have to go back to the darkest moment in Slovak journalism, and it's the murder of Jan Kuciak,
Yes.
my colleague, and his boss, Peter Bardy, is here with us. And after his murder, actually a lot of journalists felt the pressure to go back to the basics. And we face this pressure. How do we explain to the people what we are doing without seeming too self-involved? Without turning Jan into a PR product. And I think that we, thanks to people like Peter, like some of my colleagues, we handled that well. And there was a massive understanding, even in groups we didn't expect. And perhaps the point is that find the right balance to talking about ourselves, to be self-involved, to explain what we are doing and how we are doing. And also, it's a challenge for publishers because publishing fake news is so cheap. You know, most of the sites work in a way that they steal your commentary, your photo, and attach a couple sentences that this is how the liberal, Satanist news are responding. And again, like if I would have to counter all the trolls on my site, I would have to fire at least 5 more people to delete the messages. And fortunately, my publisher, the majority publisher, understands that. And so we are very careful with personal cuts at the expense of quality. And so maybe that's positive, that we are not going down to the level of these propaganda sites in order to fight them. But even if it is a more difficult road, we are sticking to explaining and to being too complicated, you know, and too liberal for some.
Yeah. Well, okay. That is inspiring, Beata. And I do want to say, and this is something I've said to Canadian journalists when we had some meetings to get ready for this conference. As a former journalist, but someone who isn't a journalist anymore, I would say to all the journalists here, don't be shy writing about the media and the press and the challenges that true independent media faces. I do feel exactly what you said, Beata. I feel that journalists have this inbuilt instinct that you don't want to seem self-involved, but you are part of the liberal democracy story today. And I would encourage journalists to write about that too. Edison.
Yeah, I think that it's we don't put all the responsibility to fight against misinformation in the media and in the journalists, because you know the role of the media and the journalists in the democracy is, you know, have accountability to the government and you know, do investigate journalists and not to speak about a false news and you know, waste time and resources, the few resources that they have, and try to, you know, to prove the truth of the false. And then I think that we need to, I have a congratulation for UK and Canada to put in discussion this issue, because the society needs to, you know, engage with this situation and try that the society, you know, distinguish between propaganda and information, quality information and misinformation. And also, you know, I think that we are in the era of the digital era with the velocity to disseminate this kind of information, and we refer to the experience in Mexico in the last election, that all the players, you know, have a basic agreement to fight during the election against misinformation. And then the electoral body also, the state and the electoral body, have a deal, and writing a deal with Facebook, Google, and Twitter. and also with the traditional media and the fact checkers to fight against misinformation, not about the public debate or the campaign, but when a misinformation is coming inside the environment, all of these actors coordinate some actions to warn to the public that we have behind intentional misinformation and disinformation, and for example, Google and Facebook agree that when the traditional media detect a misinformation, they lowers the circulation over the platform, and then when Facebook and Google detect a misinformation about the process, the electoral process, warn to the electoral authority, and the electoral authority, also disseminate or have a press conference to alert to the public of this misinformation. This is the kind of agreements, deals, and coordination that we will be to confront this situation, and also have more research and more investigation about the phenomenon, because the phenomenon is permanent mutation in one hand, and in the second hand, we don't have what is the final effect of this kind of misinformation, and what is the damage that doing. We have, when I confront and face a fake news or a misinformation, we know that, but we don't know what is the real effect that we have, and perhaps we attack with a missile a little damage that this kind of misinformation did. No?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Amina, you get the last word. You gave us a very moving description of how horrible the occupation has been for Crimea, and thank you also for referring to the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. It's not the first time that they have suffered greatly. But you are here. You are a deputy minister representing still independent and sovereign Ukraine. Give us, an example of why Ukraine is still able to be standing.
Thank you, Chrystia. Actually, in 2014, Ukraine had to choose what way to walk. We were very seduced to actually go the path of restrictions and securing our space. But from another hand, we understood that freedom of media is not just a declaration. It's something that we really have to follow, because we had the case, and we have the case of Russian Federation, when the level of propaganda is that high, that the perception of the citizens of Russian Federation is that strong, that whatever argument you come up with, you can't break through the wall of their perception of Ukraine, Western world, US, and other countries. So we know that in short-term perspective, it may give you an illusion that it's a very strong tool that someone could use, but in a long term, it deprives you. The main thing is a critical thinking. And we believe that if you don't have critical thinking, it's a fated society. So for us, it was about looking for the balance. We managed to have the reform of public broadcasting. We launched the TV channel that is state-funded but not interfered by state. We really don't have any state censorship, and we have civil society representatives from Ukraine and journalists that may confirm you that state does not interfere anymore into the editorial policies. We have launched the foreign broadcasting system, the TV channel UATV, something that we never had before in the history of Ukraine. The mission of this channel is to be the first-hand information about Ukraine in different languages. We also developed the doctrine of information security, and the majority of the implementation of the doctrine is about Stratcom. And actually, we used the British case on the governmental communications of the one voice policy, on monitoring and the capacities on to track the social turbulences and communicate from the state whatever and whatever is needed. We're also happy that we have very active and strong civil society, and we're very thankful to Canada and UK and many other European countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Baltic states, who are supporting and financing the civil society, also tracking Stop Fake, Info Napalm, IMI, Institute of Mass Information, and many more. So I think that we have to keep on doing what we do, and our slogan of our Ministry of Information Policy is that the best counter-propaganda is truth. We have to find the ways to deliver this truth.
Okay, I think that could be all of our slogan. Well, I don't think we can top that. The best counter for disinformation is truth. I want to underscore one of the great things that Edgars said as well, that at the end of the day, the counter is to inform our citizens. And what I have learned, particularly from the Baltic republics, from Ukraine, is that an informed, engaged citizenry, that ultimately is the best defense against disinformation. Au bout de ligne, je voudrais remercier mes collègues.
Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues who shared their experience and have given us many ideas and much inspiration.